We've been talking about, the last couple of weeks, of course, of Easter, kind of appropriate, talking about how that applies to us and what the relevance of it is to us. And I remember mentioning, maybe last week or the week before, just growing up in church and being around church things quite a lot, I always got the impression, I had the impression that in the church world at large, that it's kind of a struggle to know how to deal with it. You know, in other words, how to make it pertinent to us. Because if we just see the death and resurrection of Christ as something that happened to one man 2,000 years ago, it's hard to see, it's hard to make a connection with us. In other words, if it's just something that happened to Jesus, well, we stand off as spectators and look at it, and we might feel bad about it, about him being crucified, and we might say, how great he's raised from the dead. But then we go on about our lives, and if it's just something that happened to one person 2,000 years ago, well, it's an interesting story, but then how does that mean anything very important or special to me? Well, the reason is, if we go on reading in the New Testament, of course in the Gospels, it tells us that he was crucified. That's true. And he was raised from the dead. It tells us that in the Gospels, first-hand accounts. But as we get into the epistles of Paul, we find out something additional. We find out why it happened and what went on from the point of view of God. In the mind of God, what was taken and what actually did take place. I say it that way because it's not evident to the physical senses. His disciples saw him crucified, but they didn't understand what God was doing. They couldn't see that God was laying all the sins of humanity onto Jesus, and he was paying for them and taking in his own body the judgment of God. They couldn't see that just by standing there with their physical senses. So we have to read the epistles of Paul to find out why it's relevant to us. And we find out some remarkable things. We find out that from God's point of view, as he shared with Paul, it wasn't just something that happened to one man 2,000 years ago. That one man was our representative. And so, in effect, it happened to us. Because God so loved the world, as we read in John 3:16, that he gave his only begotten Son. He so loved that whoever believes in him might not perish. We know that's what it says. He loved us so much that he sent Jesus to the cross to take our place so that he wouldn't have to punish us for our sins. So Jesus could take our place. And so, in effect, we were there. We used to sing a song in the Methodist Church when I was growing up, "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" Have you ever heard that song? I'm sure you might have heard it, maybe sung it. I remember every Easter we'd sing that song. It sounds very sad song. But, the truth is we were there. Yes. We were there. And we don't know about it until we read about it in the pages of the epistles of Paul. We were there. In fact, Paul says it this way. I guess I might as well start with this one. Phil can put it on the screen there. Galatians 2:20, I'll just refer to this. We talked about it last week and the week before. Paul says it this way. I was crucified with Christ. That's how he said it. I was. Now, that might be news to you. Well, I didn't know that I was. Well, that's why he's telling you. I was crucified with Christ. Now, some people read that and they think, well, that's just some high state of spiritual attainment that Paul has arisen to. No, he's not saying that it's anything special about him. Paul is just because Jesus carried the sins of Paul. Paul's the writer on the cross. And not just Paul's sins, but yours as well. So, in effect, we were crucified with Christ. That's the way God sees it. The death of Christ was not just one man, it was us too. He says, I am crucified with Christ. Then he says, nevertheless I live. Now see, we could maybe embrace that thought, and we should. But if it's true, then here I am. If I was put to death and crucified with Christ, look at me, I'm still alive. But he says, look, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. He's saying this is the way we should view the death and resurrection of Christ. That we were crucified with Christ. Why? Because we needed to be. Now, again, being in church a lot, I have had the experience of getting the impression, if it wasn't explicitly told, that it's up to you to crucify. We like to use this kind of language. It's sort of spirit. It sounds very spiritual. I'm trying to crucify. I remember one time coming to Promise Keepers meeting. We used to have Promise Keepers meetings all the time. Maybe they still do. Have they still meeting, Charlie? Do you remember? Yeah. But I remember one time going into Promise Keepers meetings. One man, particular man, walked into the meeting, and I said, in a very cheerful tone of voice, because I was cheerful, I said, "Hello, brother, how are you doing?" And he said, in a very mournful, sad tone, he moaned first. He said, "Oh." Oh, he said, I don't know what he was thinking of, He said, oh, it's hard, he said. Oh, kind of moaning, like somebody struggling under a great burden, you know. Like if you had a terrible weight on your back and you're struggling to carry this thing. Oh, he said, it's hard to crucify the old flesh. Yeah, right. You know, and I've got this little piece of paper. I'm not going to... I've got right here. Oh, it's the first one. My news story. I always like to pull this out when we talk about this. Man treated after attempting to nail himself to a cross. And I'm not going to read it. You've heard me read it before. But it is hard. You know, and this guy took it literally. He probably was in church and heard him talking about crucifying the flesh and maybe a little mentally disturbed and went home and tried to do it. He got 2x4s and big nails, and he nailed down, that's true, he nailed down one hand onto this board and called 911. And they said when they got there they weren't sure if he wanted treatment for his wound or help nailing the other hand down. But you see, that it's funny, but it makes a point. Even if you tried to literally crucify yourself, you can't do it. Like that man who said, oh, it's hard to crucify the old flesh. He meant metaphorically, like we say in church, trying to suppress what's bad about, bad behaviors or something. That's the way we use that. It is hard. In fact, it's so hard you can't do it. That's why Jesus was crucified. He didn't put you on a cross, but in a sense he did in the body of Jesus. He let Jesus do it for you, and you get the benefit of that. Because, see, the reason people say that in church, it's hard to crucify this old flesh because we recognize this, that there are certain things that should go, right? But we think it's up to us. We think God's sitting up in heaven with his arms folded saying, when are you guys going to get busy and do what I told you to do? See, he knew, God knows that if it were up to us, it wouldn't get done. In fact, if it were up to us, he wouldn't have sent Jesus. Did you ever think about that? If it were up to us, Jesus didn't need to come at all. Sorry, I don't mean to speak in a loud tone of voice. You can hear me just fine, I know. It's just kind of surprising. He didn't need to come at all. And if he was just going to come as a teacher or an advisor, it didn't need to be Jesus. Anybody could have been a teacher or an advisor. He could have sent messages through angels or through anybody. But see, what needed to be done was something only Jesus could do. It was something we could not do. We could not put to death what was wrong. But Jesus, in his own body on the cross, put to death what was wrong with us. And what are we supposed to do about that? We're supposed to believe in it and embrace that. But not only that, Paul says, nevertheless I live. Now here's the way he views the resurrection of Christ. Yet not I. It's Christ that lives in me. Now you might not feel like that's true from day to day, but it is true. So you might not feel like, if you examine your past experience, that it's true, but it is true. How do you know that? Well, he wouldn't have said that. That's one thing. He wouldn't have said that unless it is true. But see, here's the thing. It is true, but it takes a certain degree of changing the way we think about it to experience it. Now, this is what I was going to talk about today. What do we, Paul says, I was crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, it's Christ that lives in me. So how do we conduct our lives in the light of it? Let's just say that we embrace those truths and agree that they're true. Well, Paul's got things to tell us. But this is Galatians. Look in Colossians, Phil. Give me Colossians chapter 3. Look at what he says here. Paul's got actually a lot to say about this. And really, I think this is the core of living the Christian life. It's not about turning over a new leaf and trying to do better and exerting strenuous moral effort. It's about believing in something that's already been done for us and just simply walking with Christ and walking in the light of it. Now, one thing we believe that Christ has done for us is he was crucified for us, to put to death what was wrong with us. And then Paul said, it's not me living, it's Christ that lives in me. We were raised together with Christ, is what we're told. Colossians chapter 3 says this, if you then be risen with Christ. Stop right there for a minute. When he says, if you then be risen with Christ, he's not saying if in the sense that there's any doubt about it. It's a rhetorical if. In other words, you could say the same thing, say, since you have been risen with Christ. Some translations say it this way. Since you have been risen with Christ. In other words, since it's true. Since when you were crucified with Christ, and when he was raised from the dead, God saw that as your resurrection as well. That's your new life. That's why we're baptized, by the way. Remember last week we read that. Paul said we're baptized because as we're into the water, it's identifying with the death of Christ, but we don't just stay in the water. I've been to a lot of baptisms, and you don't just leave them under the water.